It's been several years since I last met up with Edward, so it's a joy to be able to do so over Zoom just recently. Edward has been on the team of Cornhill training course in Scotland since its beginnings and is still actively involved in that. And I appreciated his taking time out to talk to me about the great work of preaching. I'm truly grateful to you for taking the time to share in this way. Could we begin? Could you just give me a 2-minute resume or recap of your ministry experience, just to introduce yourself to folk who may not know you at this point?
Yes, gladly. I was ordained in the Anglican Church in England in the mid-1970s, and so I had experience working as an assistant pastor in different parishes in Manchester. And then I became a senior pastor in my early 30s, and I was senior pastor at 2 different churches in the Derby diocese, at Glossop and then at Burton-on-Trent. And it was during that time that I began to realize that the preaching ministry, the exposition of the Bible, so not simply preaching, but expository preaching, was the thing that built the church. I was much helped by Dick Lucas in those early days. And Dick got a lot of us young men together in the early 80s. And he began to show us that the real preaching that changes the church and builds up the church is the preaching that tackles the Bible very seriously, requires a lot of hard work of study. And then that combination of studying what the text meant then and what it means now and how it applies to our thinking and our behavior, I began to spot that that was the thing that really does enable people to hear the voice of the Lord. Now, back in those days in England, the charismatic movement was becoming pretty powerful. And people were wanting to hear the voice of the Lord in rather different ways, and I think much less satisfactory ways. So to hear Dick Lucas and others like him saying, and John Stott as well, saying that it's the exposition of the Bible that really does the work, was to me very heartening. So I tried to put that into practice in my own ministry as a local church leader. And then having done that for quite a number of years, I was then asked to come to Glasgow by Willie Phillip, who's the minister of the Tron Church in Glasgow. And Willie, having recently arrived in Glasgow and having worked with the Proclamation Trust in London for some years, wanted on his return to Scotland to start some sort of training which would help people, young people mostly, to learn the principles of Bible exposition. So the Cornhill training course in Glasgow was started in 2006. I was its initial director, working closely with Willie. And we've been going now since 2006, and we've seen, I think, more than 300 students come through the course in that time, many of whom are now working full-time in some sort of gospel ministry. So it's been a great blessing, and what we're trying to do at Cornhill is to not simply train preachers who will go back into the larger churches in cities like Edinburgh and Glasgow and Aberdeen, but we want increasingly to get the good preachers and good church leaders out into the sticks. So that you might go to somewhere right up in the Highlands or in some small town in central Scotland and find good Bible teaching allied to good leadership. That's what we're trying to do, because we're aware that the standard of preaching and leadership in the churches is far short of what it should be, really. So that's been my experience in a nutshell over the
Amen. That's helpful. As you look back on your own journey in preaching and ministry, how did you begin to sense that was where God was calling you? That was his call on your life to be a preacher?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think I was encouraged when I was a young preacher by people who said to me, Edward, you've got a certain ability here. Develop it and use it. You can preach in such a way as to force people to listen to what you have to say, and you are learning how to open up the Bible well. So I think it was just the encouragement of that and seeing people doing it. I've mentioned Dick Lucas, but there were a number of others in the south of England who were doing it very well. And and I realized that I was never taught at college how to be a preacher. Um, yeah, I went to an Anglican theological college, but the two things that we were not taught to do were preaching and church leadership.
Wow.
And those are the two things that are most essential, really. How to open up the scriptures strongly, but also how to lead a congregation lovingly, but with discipline and understanding. So people just encouraged me, and I thought, well, if I've got a certain ability, I owe it to the Lord to develop as best I can. And certainly since I've been here in Glasgow teaching the arts of preaching to students, I have learned so much more. I think I was 55 when we started this course, back in 2006, and I have learned so much, even though I'd done a lot of preaching up to that point, but I've learned so much by actually doing it.
Yes.
And it's been so encouraging to me to be working with mostly younger students who ask the stimulating and searching questions, and to be asked those searching questions again and again in the classroom and outside the classroom forces one to have to work out decent answers to them.
Yes. You make a really interesting point there, because I've often thought this since being in a training ministry now for 15, 16 years. I've learned more in those 15 years than I did in the 25, 30 years before that. It's a strange dynamic, but it's absolutely true. I grow more in my knowledge and understanding by teaching it, and interacting with students. It's a fascinating thing. I've never quite worked out why, but it seems to be true.
I think it is very true. I sometimes say to our Cornhill students, carry on as a Bible teacher for as long as you possibly can, because while it will bring blessing to other people, the person who gets most blessed is the teacher himself.
Absolutely.
Because you have to work through the scriptures and you have to ask all the hard questions.
Yes.
And you can't sweep a verse under the carpet because it doesn't quite fit into the passage.
Yes.
As Dick Lucas used to say, if there's something in a Bible passage that seems odd, that's the thing that you've really got to tackle, because you'll often find that is the key thing that affects your whole understanding of that passage.
Sure.
Because if you look at a verse and say, oh, that's a difficult verse, I will avoid that.
Yes.
You're probably not going to learn the main important
That's
lesson.
right. Yes. I was in London for 7 years back in the 80s, and I went to Dick's expositions for expositors, which were just gold dust in terms of time of investment and all the rest of it. And he has such a profound influence on me. And you mentioned him and people like John Stott. Who are the men who have shaped you in terms of your view of preaching and your own use of preaching? Who are the influences on your life?
Well, those two men particularly, they would stand out. But there've been a number of others people that I've heard preaching and have done it really well. Billy Graham, for example. His style and approach was quite simple, but he was unashamed and strong. And I used to go to his crusades down in England and take coach loads of people to hear him. And his bold approach, his complete confidence that Christ is the answer to everything, was something that impressed itself upon me. And then various books that I've read. Martin Lloyd-Jones, a Welsh preacher. I heard him a couple of times when I was young. And I remember reading his book, Preachers and Preaching, or Preaching Preachers, many years ago. And again, there's a kind of strength and confidence. Confidence in the Bible. That, I think, is the big thing. That if we can teach our preachers to trust the Bible, then they will make the effort to dig away, work at it, work at the meaning, and then preach it with confidence and firmness. And so I think it's that kind of example. I could perhaps mention one or two others, but it's that kind of example of confidence in the Bible, confidence that the Bible does the work. It's not so much the preacher's personality. Sometimes you do see preachers who are narcissistic, who are wanting to put themselves across as though they are a great servant of the Lord or whatever, and that doesn't help at all. But if the preacher has real confidence in the Bible, and people know that he has confidence in the Bible, they're going to listen and they're going to hear what God has to say.
Yes.
So I think it's been that sort of influence that has really helped me.
Yeah. As you look back, as we said, knowing now what we know, as it were, what advice would you give your younger self as you were sort of starting out?
Right. Yes. Good question. I think the main advice would be realize that the central task of Christian ministry is the teaching of the Bible, and then make sure that the way you organize your day and your week reflects that fact.
Okay.
So when I was young and first ordained, I was doing lots of different things. I'd be taking funerals and youth groups and choir practice, and there'd be so many different things. Visiting the sick, all good things to do, but I hadn't quite focused on the fact that it was the exposition of the Bible that needed to be the central feature of Christian ministry. But when I first realized that, I did begin to reorganize my life. But I think that would be the thing that, if I'd been told that at college, it would help me. But it took several years before I really came to that. But the teaching of the Bible is what Christian ministry is all about. So when you're visiting the sick in hospital, it's the Bible that you're bringing to them. When you're visiting an old lady in her home, it's the Bible message that you want to bring to her. You're not just there to drink tea and eat sandwiches. You want to bring her something from the scriptures.
Yes.
If it's the youth group or children's groups that you're helping to teach, what they need is the Bible. They don't need games and entertainment.
Yeah.
A little bit of that is fine, but
sure.
if young children, age 6 or 7 or 8, can begin to see that the Bible is what Christianity is all about, rather than, this is just a nice atmosphere for us to play around, and we sing a song occasionally, and that's quite fun. But if they can really begin to see that it's the Bible, then that is going to help them in their early years, I think. So I think that'd be the main thing. Keep the Bible at the center.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. That is helpful. I'm sure you have a fairly good awareness of what's going on in the preaching world, particularly here in the West, but you may have wider awareness of that. What encourages you as you look at the scene, and what concerns you? What do you think are the weak spots, if you like?
Well, like you, John, I am very encouraged to see a real resurgence in serious Bible preaching. And whenever I see a young preacher standing up and preaching in an unashamed and bold way, I'm very thankful to the Lord for it. And there is quite a bit of that growing around the place. I think the younger preacher who's prepared to preach boldly is going to be somebody who is in touch with other Bible teaching and Bible believing pastors and preachers who are able to form a network of encouragement. And where I see that happening, rather than a young man going to a church and doing his best, but without much support, it's real support, then I think that really helps. So I think we need to train our young preachers and pastors to pick up the phone regularly and to be often in touch with others, especially when a problem arises in their church. They've got some nasty ethical problem that they've got to confront and deal with, rather than just allowing it to go on unaddressed.
Yes.
Well, they need courage to do that sort of thing, because they need to have the courage to discipline the church ethically, as well as teach the church. So I think when I see that sort of thing happening, and I see a young man having the courage to grasp nettles in the church, that is lovely, because almost every church has nettles that have to be grasped. And the temptation to a pastor is not to grasp them.
Yes, indeed.
And then the whole church suffers if a nettle is not grasped. So when there's a combination of courageous leadership and serious Bible preaching, I think that's very encouraging. The discouraging side, I think, would be that in some preaching, even from people who would call themselves evangelical, they don't want to express the necessary negatives. The Bible is concerned always with truth, and it's truth as opposed to error.
Yes.
The Bible very typically says in all sorts of ways, not this, but that. But in a sense, that's the underlying structure of the Bible, not this, but that. So when the Bible is teaching certain things, it's equally denying other things. So I think when preaching is not prepared to express the denials, but is only prepared to express the affirmations, it's always going to be weak.
Yes.
And just to give one little example of this, I guess most of the nation heard the Archbishop of Canterbury preaching at the coronation the other day, and he took Jesus's words, "The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve." And he gave a little sermon. He only had 3 or 4 minutes, but he developed that theme that real leadership is service. Now, that's fine. But he didn't go on in the way that Jesus went on, and to give his life as a ransom for men. Because as soon as you say that, you're having to start talking about why Jesus came, why he died, and what the ransom price meant. And that brings you to the gospel.
Yes.
So what the Archbishop said was, it was a nice little encouraging word, but you didn't need to be a Christian to say that.
No,
it was just, leadership is service. That was his theme. But he wasn't prepared to go further and to talk about what is distinctive about Christ.
Yes.
If he'd done that, he would have had to deal with repentance and sin and the judgment of God and the salvation of Christ. So if our young preachers are prepared to do that, then we know that they're serious.
Yeah.
Another example, again from the royal family. You probably remember the sermon that the American bishop preached at Prince Harry's wedding.
Yes.
Now, the press raved about it.
Yeah.
The preacher said, "Love is the thing that I'm going to talk to you. It's all about love, love, love." Now, if you talk about love, of course, everyone's going to accept that. It's like talking about motherhood and apple pie. Everyone loves love. But he didn't mention marriage. And at a wedding service, what you need to talk about is marriage. Just as at a funeral service, you need to talk about the meaning of death.
Yes.
But people avoid these things because then you're really getting into Christian doctrine.
Yeah.
And it's the sharp edges of Christian doctrine, which many of our preachers are not willing to tackle because they want to be popular. And they want people to say, "Oh, that was a lovely sermon. Thank you very much." And they don't want to risk somebody coming up to them at the end of the service and saying, "Well, I didn't like what you said there."
Yes.
But we've got to risk that. We've got to risk that. So the preacher has got to say the negatives as well as the positives.
Yeah, that's really cool.
And that tends not to happen even in pulpits that are supposedly evangelical. And I've found at Cornhill, I'll give you an example. Roughly 15 years ago, when this Cornhill course was still pretty young, I'd be working through perhaps either the passage in Titus chapter 1 or 1 Timothy chapter 3, where Paul is telling Timothy and Titus about the qualities and qualifications for an elder. And I think I used to say, now these qualifications are largely moral, to do with sex and alcohol and money and the control of your temper and that kind of thing. But there's one that is intellectual, and that's the ability to teach. But in more recent years, I've had to expand that. I've had to say, yes, moral qualities, but actually the teaching thing is also, in a way, a moral quality. Because in the Titus passage, the elder is not only to hold fast to the truth, but he also has to be able to refute or contradict those who oppose the truth.
Yes.
And that requires courage, because he's got to say that there are opponents to the truth, and therefore in my preaching, I'm going to have to show the congregation why the opponents are wrong.
Yes.
And as soon as you start going into that territory, you're in polemical territory, you're in adversarial territory. So I tend to say in the classroom today, yes, you need a certain intellectual ability to be a teacher. But you've got to develop courage. If you're not willing to say why society is going wrong in this way or that way, then you're not going to preach effectively to the modern world.
That's right. Yeah, that's really helpful. I had an experience some years ago. I preached to my father-in-law's funeral. He wasn't a believer, made no pretense of being. And I said something that I've probably said in different ways at almost every funeral I've ever taken, which is the old, the next funeral you may be at may be your own sort of thing. And 3 or 4 years later, 2 years later, my wife's brother-in-law, fortified by some alcohol to give him courage at a family event, when I wasn't there, said to my wife, I really was I think his hours, but he wasn't impressed by my sermon at the funeral because I didn't go there to be reminded of my mortality. My response was part of the point of having a funeral, actually. He just wanted to hear nice flowery words about someone, but didn't want to be challenged about he was going to die and face judgment, and people don't want, as you say, that's exactly what people don't want.
Yes.
And I think this is too, I'm just thinking while I was speaking that this is where there's an interplay here between leadership and this, isn't it? Because to take those courageous stands is a mark of leadership, that you're leading, but from the authority of God's word. And that's what gives you the authority to lead as well. That's what the basis is.
Yes. And I think also, if somebody comes to you blazing angry at the end of a sermon, you have to listen carefully to what they're saying.
Yes.
But quite often, I think you can help them by saying to them, look, you're cross with me for saying this, but actually, isn't it God himself that you're angry with?
Yeah.
Because if I've just been unfolding what the Bible contains,
yes,
this is his word, and I think you're angry with him.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, I think that helps, and it forces people to think about God and not just about the preacher himself.
Yes. Yeah. I found that in my first few years of ministry in London, I found that enormously reassuring. That I suddenly came to realize, no, their problem isn't with me. Their problem is with the word, and therefore with God. And I'm just being faithful, and so it's not personal, but it's personal to God. And I found that took a whole load off my shoulder as a young man trying to find his way in preaching. Yeah, that's really helpful. Edward, if you don't mind me saying, you've been preaching for a good number of years. What task or what aspect of preparation and preaching do you find the most testing, the most demanding? And has that changed during the years, or has it been fairly constant all the way through?
That's a good question. I think the aspect of preaching preparation that I enjoy most is the first part, when I've almost got my feet on the desk and a big sheet of paper, and I'm jotting down a few ideas. I'm getting sort of into the flow of the passage. That's a little bit easier and gentler, and you can let your imagination run around a little bit. But then you've got to get down to the hard work of shaping the sermon. I think that's the hard thing, to work out what is going to be the main thrust of the sermon. And any sermon really needs to have a single main thrust, it seems to me, rather than just jumping around here and there and bringing in half a dozen different ideas. So a main thrust, which is then going to be demonstrated and illustrated in a number of different ways, but you need to have that main thrust clear. Then you need to work out a structure for the sermon, probably with 2 or 3 or 4 main headings, which cohere and which run clearly from one to the other, so that there's a sense of the sermon being a whole, single whole, rather than just like a little sort of essay or a commentary, a running commentary on the text as you go along. What we need to produce is a sermon and not just an essay or a running commentary. So it needs to have a big thrust. So working out that big thrust and then developing a structure of points which is going to demonstrate that main point. I think that's where the hardest work lies. Then you bring in illustrations and so on as well. But it's getting that structure so that the thing, I sometimes think of it as being a bit like when you're sharpening a pencil. You've got to pare stuff away so as to make the point sharp. And we have to clear a lot of stuff out of a sermon so as to make what remains really sharp and pointed. So that the thing is penetrating and does have sharp edges. So I think that's hardest. But if one is prepared to work at it, then the people who are listening are going to be much more helped, I think, because they'll take something away that they remember.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you. Just one last thought. We talked about what advice would you give your younger self starting out. Now, and this will be a question you'll quickly identify with in your particular ministries. What one piece of advice would you give to a young man just beginning, even just tentatively taking the first steps into preaching? What one piece of advice would you give him? He may want to look back on in years past and say, I remember Edward telling me that, how true that was.
Yes, good question. Good question. I think it would certainly revolve around the careful study of the Bible. So I'd want to say to a young man, make your study of the Bible the main thing. But I think I would perhaps want to add this, that your preaching and teaching of the Bible over the years it's for the sake of the congregation. Mm-hmm. So when you start off, you're very self-conscious and you think, am I doing a good job? What do they think of me? Do they like me? Or do they think I'm hopeless at it? Inevitably, you're quite self-conscious when you start off. Mm-hmm. As time goes on, you come to realize that people are hungry for truth. Mm-hmm. Many of them are suffering. I mean, everyone is suffering to some extent. There's going to be some suffering, even in young and healthy-looking lives. So in bringing the words of God to them, you're bringing them not just intellectual information, but you're bringing them food for the soul. And that food for the soul is going to fortify them for the week. And then they're going to come back the following week and they need more. So I think I would say to the young person, do your Bible study, prepare your teaching carefully, but do remember that it's an expression of your love for the people. Yes. When you stand there in the pulpit, or if you're leading a Bible study group of some kind, but it's for their sake and they need it. They're like baby birds sitting in the nest, opening their beaks saying, feed me, because they need feeding. Mm. And if they get good food, they're going to flourish as Christians and they will become strong and enduring. Mm. They'll be able to have what the book of Revelation calls the patient endurance. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what we're wanting to do these days is to stimulate the growth of strong churches where the individual members know how to go on as Christians.
Yes.
And last through the Christian life. So I think for the preacher, think of your Bible preparation very carefully, but remember this congregation, love them and feed them, because they will be strengthened to endure if you do that. Mm-hmm.
Yes, but it's not just love the word; it's love the people. Yes. To be a faithful preacher, isn't it?
It is.
That's right. That's right.
And then a lovely relationship develops between the pastor and the people, because they know that although he's got his weak areas and so on, but he loves them. And if they realize that he's spending significant amounts of time every week studying his Bible and preparing to teach them and to feed them, they will appreciate him. And if he gives that love, he'll receive love he needs in return. And it's the way to develop a good relationship, I think, with the church.
And it's also easy to say the hard stuff then as well, isn't it? Yes. Because they know that you're saying it out of love, not out of a sort of judgmental, critical spirit.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So if they're able to say, yes, our pastor is not frightened of saying the things that need to be said, and if he's opening up a Bible passage that has difficult aspects to it, we know he's not going to neglect them. He's going to bring up what needs to be said about them, and they will trust his leadership all the more for that, I think.
Mm-hmm. And I want to just one question I've not asked anybody else so far, but I think I probably will do more of. And again, I appreciate this is off the cuff. If there's one book on preaching that you would recommend above all others to read, apart from the Bible, of course, what book would you recommend?
I would say without any question, John Stott's book, which originally came out under the title "I Believe in Preaching." And then I think it's now published under Between Two Worlds, something like that.
Yes.
And the two worlds being the world of the Bible and the world of our modern society. I think it's a magnificent book. I've read it 2 or 3 times. And he gives a wonderful historical survey of how preaching has grown up in the church over 20 centuries. But then lots of excellent teaching on how to prepare sermons, how to be authentic, bold, courageous, loving, all this sort of thing. And he was, of course, himself a wonderful preacher. And it's, I suppose, the recordings of him preaching are probably available if you dig around.
Yes.
And would be well worth listening to. But I would certainly recommend John Stott, I think. There are many fine books around, but that's the one that stands out to me in my life.
Helpful. Yeah, that's helpful. Edward, I really appreciate you taking time this morning. Thank you so much. It's been just a joy to talk to you again and to pick your brains and talk over some of these things.
Well, lovely to have this opportunity to see you again, John. Yeah.
Thanks, Edward.
Okay.
The Lord bless you and all you do for him.
Thank you. And you too, John.
Okay. God bless you. Bye.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
talking this weekend, hope is also a commodity in short supply, but not always in demand. I get the sense that people have conditioned themselves to live without real hope. They just get by from day to day, distracting themselves, and they don't think about the apparent meaninglessness and the vulnerability of their life.